All right, I think we are live. Is that right, Omar? Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. It's a really important webinar. My name is Neil Hetherington. I have the awesome privilege of being the CEO of the Daily Bread Food Bank. And tonight, we're going to talk about the Who's Hungry report. Last week, we released the 2022 Who's Hungry report, and it has some pretty troubling statistics in it. It has troubling statistics, it has troubling stories of individuals who are experiencing food insecurity. We're going to discuss that, what is going on in Toronto, what is going on with the systems, and most importantly, how we might change that. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and now our is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and we acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's from these first peoples that the covenant of the one dish, one spoon emerged. That treaty, it teaches us that to take only what you need and to leave something for everybody else. It's an appropriate reminder for those who live here together now. So welcome everybody, panelists, and to everybody who has chosen to spend a little bit of their evening learning more about what is going on in the city of Toronto. We're doing this webinar because we have seen a record increase month after month in the number of individuals that we are seeing at the Daily Bread Food Bank and with North York Harvest. Within the Daily Bread context, before the pandemic, we saw about 60,000 clients per month. That number is now 190,000 clients per month. It has meant that Daily Bread has more than tripled the amount of food that we are shipping out, and it has meant that the 193 food programs that we have across the city have had to rise to meet that occasion. And that's why we're talking about a system under strain. Each of those food banks and Daily Bread have felt a strain alongside the individuals that we are serving. So I'm going to leave it at that and introduce the author of the report along with her team. Diane Dyson has done an excellent job to be able to create this report. It's her first Who's Hungry report, but she's been an incredible leader in the community, writing and researching and advocating for systemic change throughout her career. And I'm delighted to be able to get to work alongside Diane every single day. And so I'm going to turn it over to Diane, who's going to formally introduce each of the panelists. Over to you, Diane.
Thank you so much, Neil, and back at you. Just a little boast, Daily Bread won an award today for great corporate culture, and it comes down to good leadership. So thank you. I will do all the introductions. Quick housekeeping. I don't need to tell you where the bathrooms are. You can find those on your own. But in terms of Zoom land, we do have the closed captioning enabled so that you can look at the transcript as you want. Audience members, you are welcome to submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we will have a section near the end where we will turn to those and see what else we might be able to answer. Apologies if we don't get to everything. We are also recording tonight's event, so if you choose to share it later or amplify it, our thanks to you for that as well. Okay, so I'm delighted to be able to welcome all of the folks who are here today. And I'll do it one by one because they were each chosen because of what they'll be able to bring to the conversation tonight. Tonight's event is not about doing a PowerPoint slide that tells you horrifying number by horrifying number about what's happened to food banks and the people that use them, but more to talk about what do we see on the ground and what are the openings where we might be able to push forward and push through. These are conversations that we hope are happening at policy tables and at kitchen tables. Talking about the issue of food security has risen to the forefront of policy discussions, and the people here tonight are leaders in being able to advance all of that. First, I want to introduce Kirsten Beardsley. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Food Bank Canada. Food Banks Canada vision is to relieve hunger today and to prevent hunger tomorrow. I just thought that encapsulated so much the difficulties sometimes of the work that we do. And so I wanted to flag that. It is uphill work. Their recent report, Hunger Count 2022, is subtitled From a Storm to a Hurricane. It's a theme I think that emerged through our report, and we will be seeing in Feed Ontario's report on Monday when they release theirs. Next, David Hurley. Many of us have long watched David Hurley as a political commentator on shows such as TVO Agenda and CBC panels. Any policy wonk recognizes his insightful and sometimes fervid commentaries on Canadian political life. And you can listen to him now regularly on the Hurley Burley podcast. I urge, it's always a fun listen. But I was delighted when I learned that he has lent his intelligence to the Maple Leaf Centre for Food Security, looking at how do Canadians think about these issues of hunger and food security. And so he will bring some great insights tonight on where we might go forward. I'm happy to welcome also Dr. Olive Wahoosh. She's an educator, a researcher, and a professor at McMaster University, where she's the Associate Director of Newcomer Health, Community, and International Outreach in the School of Nursing. She's worked most recently, and how I heard about her from colleagues, worked most recently with Hamilton Food Share for years, looking at the impact of that network of 100 food banks and pantries. And so she brings the hard evidence behind the issues that we're talking about. And finally, not last, really a treasured member of the Daily Bread family is Devi Arasanyagam. Devi's the co-founder of the Fort York Food Bank. She's worked inside government and in the nonprofit sector and is a long-standing contributing member of Daily Bread's Agency Advocacy Committee. And I always value the insights she brings because of her participation across multiple sectors. So I want to welcome you all and thank you for being here tonight. So the first, as in any good storytelling, you have to start with a crisis or a tension. And so we're going to start with the strain on the system. Where do we go? What are we seeing here? And Kirsten, I'm going to start with you. The Hunger Count report came out just a couple of weeks ago, giving a national picture of over 1 million people having to use food banks in March before the first waves of inflation even hit the consumer. I think Who's Hungry has also found and underscored many of the themes that you first profiled. How bad is it out there right now?
Thanks, Diane. Yeah, I don't want us to get tired of hearing this if we all come out with these reports, but I really think things are really the worst we've seen. So what we call our Hunger Count report is that it should be a devastating wake-up call to this country. What we're seeing is the highest level of food bank use in our history in Canada, which is not obviously anything to be proud of. So if we look at the numbers, what that looks like is that food bank use is up 35% since prior to the pandemic. And that's a really short span of time for that kind of growth. So for some historical context, after the 2008 recession, food bank use went up about 30% over a longer period of time, and then it leveled off. So we were still hitting that sort of post-2008 level heading into the pandemic. Now we're up in a very short span of time, another 35%. So as you said, Diane, what that looks like in 1 month alone this year, that's nearly 1.5 million visits to food banks across the country. And what we're seeing is, I think what we can all feel, it's the costs that, as you said, even some of those costs weren't even in full swing, but they were beginning. So the end of some of the pandemic supports at the end of last year, coupled with high costs, and meet that with a broken social safety net that's leaving far too many people behind. So anyone who was at or near the edge, we're just seeing they've tipped over. And some of the concerning trends that we noticed in our report, and they're very, you echo them, they're very similar to what Toronto is seeing, but we're seeing them across the country. So a rising number of seniors relying on food bank services, post-secondary students, we're seeing that number grow. Indigenous people, that number is rising at an alarming rate, as well as low-income workers. So those who report employment as their primary source of income, we're seeing that grow. And then there are the stubborn trends, the ones that we've seen, consistently over the years. A third of the people who are supported by food banks are children. That number, no matter, what supports are out there, that number seems to be a stubborn one, as well as single adults. And you gave a little bit more in your report, a little bit more depth to what that whole picture could look like in terms of social isolation. But single adults living alone without another income make up nearly half of food bank users in Canada, and renters. So another thing that helps guide some of the policy asks we make, but most of the food bank clients in this country pay market rents. And then I think, we hear those numbers, but what I want to say most of all is that these are real people. Behind every one of these numbers is a person who is put in a position they should not have to be put in, to have to reach out to a charitable organization to receive support. And that's what I always try to remind myself of. I never want to feel untouched by the data. These are people and our neighbors, and we have to, I think, if not now, when, we have to find change so we don't see this continuing trend.
Thank you. Devi, the report is called A Story of a System Under Strain. What's happening in the food bank where you serve in downtown Toronto?
So thanks, Diane. If people hear some traffic in the background, it's because I'm living on the equivalent of Yonge Street in Sri Lanka. So excuse the sound, the noise. So the Fort Food Bank is a small downtown food bank. It's typical of most food banks in Canada, very grassroots, run by volunteers. We're lucky enough to have 1.5 staff, but it's mainly volunteers who kind of lead the organization, as we're all familiar with. So when we do open the doors, what we see, I'm usually there once a week, long lineups. People start lining up at about 5:30 in the morning, very anxious to get in place. There's that fear that food banks are going to run out of food if they come later. And so that's what we see. And reflecting what Kirsten said, yes, first of all, the face of poverty seems to be changing. The people we're seeing at food banks are seniors, people who are employed younger, between 24 and 54 years old, educated with post-secondary education, a lot of families with young children. And basically, since March of this year, a number of them are fully employed, and some of them actually used to donate to the food bank as well. Now, I did look at the stats. So we're a small food bank, but what we experience is reflected in the rest of Canada and Toronto. So when COVID struck, we noticed a huge uptick in numbers. We thought, this is it. We've never experienced this before. I've been involved in food security for the last 30 years. I was pretty hopeful that when the economy started opening up, that things were going to change, people were going back to work and all that. In March, I was in Sri Lanka again, and I happened to look at the daily numbers, and I began to see a dramatic increase. And I have to say, we've seen a 109% increase at our small food bank. So previously, we used to see during COVID, I'm just talking about one day of the week, Saturdays, 250 people was considered a huge number. Now we're hitting 700 people on a Saturday. And one of the reasons why Saturdays seems to be busy is because the folks coming to us cannot make it during the week. They're all employed. And so, Diane, you raised the question in your report that so having a job really isn't enough at this point because of housing, transit, other fixed causes. And people are doing their best even with housing. Most people aren't able to live alone. They're living in very dire housing situations, lots of shared situations, living in basements and things like that. And I think it'll come out when the rest of you talk about. But what I do want to end with, it's very humbling to reflect on how food banks have continued to weather these increases. it's uncommon for organizations and businesses to be able to kind of quickly kind of get staff and volunteers and food and all that, and to be able to run as efficiently as we do. So kudos to everyone out there.
How are your volunteers doing?
Well, we talk about succession planning in the whole nonprofit sector. And I must say, living in Toronto, first of all, we were exhausted during COVID. We were running with small teams. And fortunately for us, we have really a great community of volunteers, and that enthusiasm and optimism is what makes us go on. But there's a lot of frustration with, for us who've been doing this for a long time. And so, it's like 30 years, we're still talking about the same issues. We are seeing very little progress. And, I think that it was sort of, and I'm interested in hearing what David has to say about this, because the community feels really strongly, but we kind of feel helpless when it comes to making systemic changes.
Okay, thank you. I was going to throw it to Olive now. Good. Olive, Debbie has just given us a powerful description of the challenges that they're facing on the ground
Yes.
and on the street that strains them every week. What does it mean if food banks were to fail?
It's interesting because I don't work in the food bank, but I've been working with Hamilton Food Share now for quite a while as we completed our research, and it was just pre-COVID. So we analyzed their data set of 13,000 individuals, and we actually surveyed another 720 of those individuals, and 53 participated in focus groups, because we were interested in the stories behind, the actual lived experience as well as the numbers. And the reason that our attention was pulled to this, the Canada childcare benefit had just had a significant increase. And of course, then the expectation is that families with children, you have fewer of them attending the food bank, and that was not the reality. The numbers actually went up by 1,000. And so that was this journey that we went on. But what we found was, frankly, staff are stressed. They do need supports. What I found among the stories was it's much more than food. It's much more than food that people are getting from food banks. And that's what Joanna Santucci, the executive director for Hamilton Food Share, really wanted to get at that. What is the value for the clients? And so I heard about the isolation being spoken of. And so what we heard were stories of some days that is the only individual, the only other human being that food bank client will be speaking to is the person at the food bank. And I mean, how awful is that? So the isolation was major. The surprises for me, and I teach social determinants of health, I just want to say, the surprise for me was all walks of our society are there. The people you've just heard about who are fully employed, people with children, single adults, seniors, people living with disabilities. The shock for me was how many youth were also attending, and they would tend to have been attending multiples. And the other is the cycling in and out, because you read the press sometimes, if people would just get a job or people would just get themselves together. And it's so unfair, so unrealistic. And the piece that I get upset about, in teaching this, we're a very wealthy nation. There is no reason for any of this, really. If we wanted to fix it, we could fix it. And so this is what I talk to my students about. We're the 7th wealthiest nation among the OECD countries, and one of the worst in terms of children living in poverty. The numbers are staggering and they're increasing. But what we found were the blind eye, when rent controls came off, that was a major impact on people. And what we found in our study was, or in our work with those individuals, the link between housing security and food insecurity is really, really powerful. And the numbers are horrendous. And they're reflected also in the Who's Hungry report. We found 96% of food bank attendees are living in unaffordable housing. And what's interesting is Joanna Santucci actually challenged me on the numbers and said, "You sure you haven't made a mistake?" And this is her game, right? She understands this. And I said, absolutely. I said, I found it staggering. And another of that, almost 40% are paying 60% or more of their income on housing. And so there's nothing left for food. And we actually had another parallel study looking at the families with childcare benefit and what they were doing, how that didn't take them out of the food bank. And it was simply, they were able to now buy additional, more nutritious food, perhaps pay down debt was a major thing, and they were able to buy their children winter clothes. And so it's these multiple knock-on effects. The business of being accessing social work, bereavement counselor, these were the stories that came up from just about everyone. When I was working with my students on this, we were pondering about how busy those lives are. Living in poverty and needing to access food banks, there's a whole cascade of other activities, and it's like a full-time job. Bottom line, just survival is a full-time job if you're in that niche. Now, my colleague Martin Dooley, who did an economics analysis of Census Canada's low-income population in Hamilton, and looked at the income and all the details of total income for food bank clients. Their report is titled "The Poorest of the Poor," and it's on the IRPP website. But he was able to show that about 2/3 of people living in poverty don't actually come to a food bank, and we don't know about their needs and what they're doing without. And we know for sure, with the detail that's captured for the food bank clients, housing is a major issue. And we weren't drilling into all of the utilities and stuff. What we got to hear were in this city, and I think probably similar in other jurisdictions, the renovictions game that goes on with landlords with impunity. And really, for people who are living this life, accessing food banks regularly, and there's not a big number of them, most are fairly short, interim, and they cycle in and out. But for those individuals, the last insult is when your landlord is trying to get you out, supposedly to fix something, and then your house is gone. We also learned that seniors couples, the alternative for them, if their situation doesn't improve over time, they're probably going to have a loved one go into a nursing home or residential care. Because we did ask the question, what would you do if food banks didn't exist? And basically, life unravels in a nutshell. Life unravels in so many ways. Pets would need to be put out onto the street. We can't afford to take them to the SPCA to be euthanized because that's a fee. It was just the detail of it was shocking. So clearly people have been checking out, what ifs. And I found it distressing that there wasn't a group in our population that wasn't impacted. It was quite illuminating, I'd say. We felt very privileged that people shared their stories with us. The quality of the housing. Some people were renting housing that had no hydro, no water,
It's incredible.
It is.
Thank you. And we've got the stats and the stories.
Yes.
So David, the hard question then comes to you is that you've been polling Canadians on the topic of food security for 3 years now. How much are people noticing the strain on people that need to use food banks?
I don't think very much, to be honest, because most people that aren't in this position are also feeling other stresses and strains and are very focused on their own circumstances right now. That doesn't mean that people are ambivalent when told at all. And it doesn't mean that Canadians are cavalier about hunger in their midst. In fact, 80% of Canadians think the federal government should be doing more to reduce hunger in Canada than it is currently doing. So it's not like people are sanguine about this, but they're not focused on it, and they're not aware, I think, so much of what's going on around them. There's been some greater awareness of insecurities and precariousness in the economy more broadly. But what I found in our survey, which was done in May, and I think things have deteriorated since May, but our survey found that the number of Canadians, so this is just going to echo what you've all been hearing, but statistically, that the number of Canadians who said that they were very concerned about their ability to feed themselves and their family had doubled in 2 years, from 12% 2 years ago to 24% today. And that's a pretty shocking figure. 24% of people describing themselves as very concerned about their ability to put food on the table. 8% of Canadians told us that that was the thing they were most concerned about in the world. Okay. And that was up from 3% 2 years ago who said that. So there's been almost a tripling of the number of people that are in a really severe situation. And I don't know that people are aware. I don't know that people are aware of that. And I think that the first tool in getting action on this is to put a spotlight on it, and is to make people confront it. Because when people are forced to confront it, they won't like it. They know, and they tell us that it violates core Canadian values to have this type of situation. But I would end these remarks by saying that, having listened to everything that you've said and how moving and compelling it is, I have to tell you that in my survey, 70% of the people who self-identify as food insecure, according to the technical definition, do not use a food bank or any other free or subsidized service. They're just out there on their own.
Yeah.
30%, 27% of people told us that they had accessed some sort of people that were food insecure said that they had accessed some sort of free or subsidized assistance. 60% of those people said food banks. So as busy as you are, as crumbling under the pressure as you are, you're servicing a fraction of the problem.
Thank you for that reality check. It's true. I think we all know that. I saw the nods as you spoke. Debbie, I'm going to turn to you, back to you then again. We found from our report and from other reports that things are getting worse, that people's incomes have dropped. And sometimes we get into, I'm just trying to figure out, how do we connect the on the ground reality that you and I know, the stories that we hear, with the common parlance of, why don't people just go get a job, or why don't they just pull up their socks? I'm doing okay, they should be doing okay. How do you respond to that?
So fortunately, I've started hearing less of that during COVID, but previously it was very, very common to hear this. But we all know that the issue around employment and workforce development is more complex. So first of all, there's a group of people who are not going to be able to work. People who should be on ODSP, people on social assistance who require far more intense supports around career planning, career counseling, training, and things like that. But as I said, this last summer, the number of new clients are primarily people who are employed, people who are working full-time or part-time. And so they are already doing the right things. They are already working. But what they're telling us is that what they make, minimum wage, doesn't really help to pay the bills. They have fixed costs, and your report clearly documents these costs: transportation, internet access, supplies for their kids going to school, food, housing costs. And so, yes, you might have a job, but these days it's not enough. And unless there's progress around minimum wage and a living income, it's going to be very, very, very difficult for people to be able to meet these fixed costs. And that's all I have to say about it. But and then, living in Toronto, there are a lot of really great employment programs and workforce development programs. And I think one of the other things that food banks are trying their best to do for people who aren't employed is to make these connections to all these organizations that exist. And it's about employment, it's about building social capital, it's helping people navigate these complex systems that we built in the city of Toronto, and it all has to go together. And food banks, as you know, are more than just food banks. They try to help people with employment, income taxes, connecting them to healthcare. For the past few years, we've been busy with COVID, with vaccine engagement strategies and connecting people to healthcare. And it's all these connections that we're trying to make. But there again, to go back to the report, without major changes within the system of income and equity, we are going to see employed people coming to food banks.
How do you think that we build that bridge so that people in the mainstream know that people using the food banks are just people too? How does that switch happen?
Is this for me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think forums like this are really, really key in making, in kind of talking about this and getting onto mainstream media and telling the stories of people coming to food banks is really important as well. It often gets lost, in a lot of reports, but I think that's where the story has to come out, and building profiles of who comes to food banks is really important as well. And we know that, the faces in my 30 years, I've seen the changes around people coming to food banks. The other piece I want to say is that people don't go to food banks for all their lives. It's very quick. People come in, they come to food banks, they get a job, a well-paid job, and they leave. But right now, what we're seeing, especially with COVID, we saw a lot of people returning to food banks, people who were precariously employed but doing okay, and now they kind of lost their jobs and they were back. And now we are also seeing people who are fully employed, never used food banks before, having to use food banks. So telling these stories is very important.
Thank you. Everybody wants to jump in, and I can see people leaning in. So the thought that provokes for me are we all just do-gooders, that will a change happen? But so who wants to jump in next? David, quick comment, unmute.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just have a quick data point that might make you all feel a little bit better about the country you live in. In that I put a statement to people and asked them to agree or disagree with it. And the statement was, most poor people could solve their own problems without help from government. The number of Canadians who agree with that statement is 8%. 8.
Thank you. Kirsten, I'm going to go to you because I think this is, we're talking about that national picture, and then you'll be up next.
Yeah, so I think this is really important to talk about the stories of people. I know, I just have a few thoughts. I don't know if they're in line with where we were going, but one of the things I wanted to share is just how tough things are right now for the food bankers themselves. And Davey, I appreciate you saying, calling out to how amazing food bankers are to absorb this amount of need. It shouldn't be what food banks are asked to do. And I just appreciate you and all of the Daily Bread folks on the call. But I am seeing people who are some of the toughest folks I know who've been at food banking a long time, hitting a bit of a wall. And it's really important to hear you say what you just said, David, because I think a lot of us feel that we are being asked to do something that food banks shouldn't be asked to do, and quite frankly, can't be asked to do. When you've got stats in the Who's Hungry report, which are gutting, 18% of people are spending 100% of their income on rent. Well, food banks can't be there to spend give everyone $1,000 worth of groceries for the rest of the month. So what are people cobbling together? And, we talk about food banks being a canary in the coal mine. We see people at food banks, we see stats, we know we're not serving the whole need, but we see people come to us before we are going to see them show up in some of the federal stats. And I'm really actually quite concerned right now with the system. And the other thing is, I'm shocked at how, we think of Toronto, of course, rent's high, but I've been from PEI to, I was speaking to the woman who runs the food bank in Cherryville, BC, which is, I don't think they have 1,000 people in town, and they're dealing with homeless encampments because people can no longer afford to live even in small towns on Prince Edward Island. We've got what you're seeing, Davey, is the number of new clients we're hearing that story across the country. People who've never thought they were in a position to have to rely on a food bank, you know, that's from St. John to Vancouver to Winnipeg. It's heartbreaking. I was on the phone lines with Winnipeg Harvest in the summer, and you know, this mom called and just, you know, her voice was cracking. Like, I don't want to have to make this call. I just can't figure it all out this month, so I've got to call you up again. But it's heartbreaking. And then the other thing that I think about is, you know, I was on a call recently with colleagues in food banks globally, so from around the world, and the strain we've got, you know, the cost of living crisis. You know, I think we're entering some pretty significant mental health issues as a society. We've got, you know, food banks being called on to respond to climate crises, you know, in a way that we've never been asked to. Like when Fiona hit, food banks had to be open because people couldn't replace a fridge full of food, right? and then you've got countries rather that are already dealing with high unemployment. And I'm worried about what's to come, and I'm coughing, so I'm going to hand it over to someone else.
Thank you. Olive, what are we thinking?
Can you restate the question? I had to duck
Yes.
out and replace my charger.
Oh, we saw you disappear and come back. Welcome back.
Yes.
Just looking, I think some of your work is very interesting, because you actually did a tie between what happens between homelessness and food insecurity. What would happen, not at the personal level to individuals, but what would happen at the system level if food banks weren't there? And I asked that because Ron Kneebone did a study out of the University of Calgary earlier this year, where he called food banks the canary in the canary in the coal mine for the social safety net, and that if we're under strain, it's because the social safety net's not working.
Absolutely. It was the number one issue for all of it. Didn't matter if it was a survey or the focus group participants. Housing, rent costs for housing and shelter were the number one issue tied in with food bank use. And for those who came, as I say, Martin Dooley called them the poorest of the poor. And as David had said earlier, about 70% don't, you know, people who need actually don't attend food banks. But for those who do, it's a lifeline that helps them stay housed. And they're still struggling to make ends meet. We heard about people who are unrelated sharing accommodation to split costs. And that's there are some risks to that too for those who are doing it. Some of the youth, you know, 2 or 3 together in an apartment to split the cost to make ends meet, because they don't have a lot of options. And, you know, there's a lot of things tied in with it too. We tend to have a system, I think, not just here, but in other countries, where if you don't progress normally through high school, etc., it's really tough to get back in to complete. It's not something that's out there and easily accessed. There are costs associated with it. The fixed and reduction, I mean, the absolute reduction in welfare supports and ODSP is horrendous. To, you know, thinking about inflation and where that was, and an announcement of 5% increase, and we're thinking, well, wait a minute, inflation's sitting at 7%, like we're not even keeping pace. Right. Those are the things. But I suspect if we don't get to start and address this in real systematic ways and consider housing as part of the package, we're in for a really rough future, with many more people becoming unhoused. The landlords seem to be able to act with a fair degree of impunity in so many ways. The business of, you know, there's information that I located recently there about the huge wait lists for affordable housing. And then the second breath was there's a delay in processing time for people who are fallen behind in paying rent. You know, the eviction process is so clogged. And I'm thinking, again, it's another message right there, like peel back the layers. And I want to scream, you know, listen here, listen to these stories. I think I really agree with Debbie. We need to get out the stories of who we're talking about. This could be you or I. I mean, when my students are asking me about it, and I said, you know, I can't help but think there, but for the grace of God go I. I said, many of these people have secondary education. Many of these people are working full time. Like, what more can we ask people to do? And we're tolerating, because a lot of people don't know fully about it, the minimum wage piece. and the nitpicking about hours so that they don't have to get benefits. Like, it all adds up. And I mean, I've heard people, because I've interviewed them, if their child is sick and they need Tylenol, which most of us would buy from a pharmacy and not think about that cost, that's a meal gone for the mom or some adult or older child in the family. Those are horrendous consequences, and we're faced with them at this time of year. So
Thank
it's
you.
these compounding issues. Yeah.
Absolutely. David, we're going to get to solutions in a couple of minutes, but I wanted your political insights on where are the shoals and the sand traps, the places that we need to be careful about. Where are the spots that might make things worse if we're not careful? Oh, mute.
Always. First of all, I think I hear a sense in this conversation that it's you against the world. And I don't want you to think that, because actually most Canadians agree with you on everything that you're saying. And it's a matter of galvanizing that. I mean, I've already given you data points that say people don't believe in bootstrapping. People think poor people need help. That overwhelmingly people think government should be doing more to reduce poverty in this country. So that's the big picture alignment. On some of the specifics that you're actually talking about, there's already tremendous public alignment with these ideas. So when I ask people whether they would support or oppose raising the minimum wage, and the wording of this is quite important, raising the minimum wage to a level that makes it a wage one can live and raise a family on, is supported by 80% of Canadians, strongly supported by 45% of Canadians, strongly opposed by next to nobody. Like, this is an idea that there are, as people see greater precariousness in the economy, there's some ideas that people are gravitating around. This is one, a minimum wage that's a real wage. The second is a basic income, which also has tremendous public support for it. Might be more divisive once the debate actually starts, but starts out making a lot of sense to people. One of the things that makes sense to people is the universality of those ideas. They don't apply only to some people. And things that programs that only benefit some people are always less popular than programs that might benefit everybody. So if Medicare was a targeted program to the underprivileged, would not have nearly the public support in this country that it has, because it's a middle-class entitlement program. And so you're actually at a really perfect, you're not lobbyists and politicians, so I don't know how you action this, but you're at a perfect time for this campaign to get some major structural change, because it isn't a niche problem right now. It's a mainstream problem right now, and everybody knows somebody who's struggling. And so it's going to seem like a good idea for our society, not a charitable thing to do for some people. I do want to take just one issue with the proposition that was put forward that what we really need to do is tell stories about the people. That's important. There's an awareness thing that's important, and there's a compassion side of this that's important. But I would also encourage you to think about one of the ways that childcare broke through. And by the way, $10 a day daycare is far less popular than either of the two things I talked about. Far less popular than raising the minimum wage to a livable level, far less. So the government's signature social policy initiative is actually quite a bit less popular than the things you're pushing for. Okay. But one of the breakthroughs that childcare had is when they started to talk about it as an economic societal benefit rather than just something that was good for moms. Okay. And once people started to say, well, actually, that makes sense. If women can participate more fully in the workforce, then we're going to have a stronger economy, and look at the difference it's made in Quebec and various things like that. Then that conversation went to a different level. You have similar arguments, and people believe them. The health results are way worse for people who are food insecure. The educational results are way worse for kids that are food insecure. These things will matter to people. right? And they'll matter to them as citizens and taxpayers, not just as people who feel sorry for people who are poor. So that's an important part of the story. That's an important part of the story as well. However, I'm going to say something, having read the report, I'm going to say something that maybe people will take issue with. I don't know.
Go at it.
In the report, you're appropriately analyzing this as the complex issue that it is, that has a million moving parts that all intersect it, and a ton of changes to this program or that program, or the way we do this or the way we do that, that would all make a difference for individual people. But that is, in terms of galvanizing public support, an impossible list of ideas.
Mhm.
It's too complicated. It's too multifaceted. It's not an idea like $10 a day daycare that people can just get behind and support and pressure politicians around. So you may have to put 20 years ago, the childcare lobbyists were like this. They had a million different prescriptions about who had to deliver it and childcare and what had to be involved in it as a component and all these various things. And they kind of dropped all that and said, listen, just give us affordable daycare for everybody. And it became a simple, supportable concept. I think behind the scenes with officials, you can keep talking about all this detail and minutia. But in terms of your public advocacy, I would encourage you to pick a lane, whether it's minimum wage, whether it's national school food program, whether it's basic income. Pick a lane and just talk about that all the time.
That's great. I want to hear the ideas from the others about what would that lane be? Where do we need to focus? Who wants to jump in? What's the ask in a tweet?
Well, I'm going to jump in because, I was thinking of this question, and in my mind, it was complex and simple, paradoxically speaking. And yes, there's so many issues that are in the report. And yes, you're spot on. There's all these things. But personally, we all have our pet issues that we want to talk about. And, and we think about why some of us got involved in this. For me, it was about social assistance rates in Ontario. I got involved in the 90s because it just made me sick to see the rates being dropped. And to me, that is what keeps me going. And I actually ended up working for Ontario Works, and that was my career, trying to make a change within. But I do agree with David. Hanging out with a lot of people who are non-food bank type, charity type people, they get very confused with all the issues that we keep raising. And it's just too complicated. And I agree, let's pick one. To me, it's, a living wage personally makes it really easy. And you think about all the economic possibilities that come out of it, especially from health, the support of local business, if people have more money in their hands, if people are paid better, they're going to be continuing working longer. There's better retention, there's savings for businesses. There's all kinds of really good arguments in support of a living wage. So that's what I would suggest.
Thanks. All of it may be an unfair question to ask a professor. What would you say in a line or two, but where would you focus?
Well, for me, I'm from Ireland, we're highly political there. And I think the audience, we need to have targeted audience members, people to hear those messages. They need to have either power of decision-making or power of influencing decision makers. So I think we need to line up very carefully who in government, which departments we need to connect with. But I would really like to see some bottom line minimum income that everyone gets. And, I'm thinking about people who need ODSP, people who need Ontario Works, or the working poor. Like, let's top those groups up so they have a living wage where they can actually put food on the table with a reasonable degree of satisfaction, and where they're not having to queue up and apply, and even the procedures are complex, and they're often feeling humiliated by them, right? So I think there's a lot that can be done. I agree with David. Fewer messages and highly targeted, I think, as well. I really do like that. And I also liked hearing about the groundswell of support, what the public is interested in. That actually restores my faith a little bit, in terms of this isn't something that people find tolerable at all. It's just they're unaware, perhaps, you know. But I think targeted messages, and the bottom line is incomes need to be at a more reasonable level for daily living.
Okay, thank you. I probably suffer from, somebody once described to me that writing a 70-page report is a hostile act. So I'm relieved that we can sum some of this up more quickly. Kirsten, where would you go?
Yeah, so I'm actually off to Ottawa on Monday to talk to some federal departments, and am a lobbyist actually. But I agree with you, David. I think we need to have, if we're going to get the voice of the people, which is, I agree with you, Olive, it's very actually quite encouraging to hear that we have this support to meet the political demands. Our director of government relations always says that the courage of politicians comes with the will of the people, right? Like that suddenly politicians are courageous when it's an election, you know, when the groundswell means that they'll get elected, it's a popular issue. So I'm not going to say, you know, I do think a minimum income floor targeted is important, but I also wonder if there's something, you know, we're talking maybe setting a target. There is actually no food insecurity mentioned in any of the mandate letters, like as an issue of itself. There's poverty, but not food insecurity, which doesn't allow for a sort of government-wide approach. So that's an issue. That's an area that we'll be talking about. I am quite concerned, you know, even in this, you know, maybe positive political environment, that the idea of, you know, dollar in, dollar out, and heading into tough economic times and having to justify, I actually worry about the austerity. And so I hope we continue these conversations about how we connect this public will to political will, because I'm not sure it's evident, and I'm not sure the food insecurity movement, as you said, David, has been quite complex, and I'm not sure we've made those connections well.
David, I think you have to provide a consult to Kirsten right on the spot, please, now. Unmute. You're muted.
You had muted me.
No,
That time.
Is that Omar?
Your guy did. I was muted by the
sorry.
system.
Speak out. All right.
How do you know when you're talking too much? When the system mutes you out of the call. I just wanted to say, if you're going to Ottawa, I would say one of the number one asks that I would have of this government almost immediately is to take this issue out of the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food and put it into Social Policy Department. It is insane that food security is under the rubric of agriculture. I worked in that government for many, many years in the federal government, and I know that agriculture is all about producers. It only cares about producers. Its whole focus is on how to help farmers, which is a great thing, but it shouldn't have anything to do with this. This is a social policy area. And there's no, what I'm saying is nobody in the government's thinking about it or working on it because it's housed in a place where nobody thinks about those things.
Thank you. I'm going to, it's almost the top of the hour, so I'm going to shift gears here and give you some of the questions that have been coming in as we've chatted, and then after that, we'll move towards solutions and wrap up. So the first question of the evening was Debbie, this might be for you, although I can step in too. For food banks with heavy traffic, have you thought about appointment onlys to help spread out, to speed up the volume and actual time that each client's in and out of the visit for each location?
So that's actually a great question. And we have been looking at it, but I must tell you that it is basically very difficult for us, a small organization, to do the appointment piece. The other piece is from a client accessibility point of view. I've been personally dealing with people who don't speak English. And so trying to help someone recently, a Ukrainian man, get an appointment at another organization, took me to have to set up the appointment for him. But it really didn't work because he couldn't talk to anyone at the agency who could speak the language. So ultimately, he just gave up in frustration and took 2 or 3 buses to come down to the food bank because he preferred to line up and get his food rather than make this appointment. So yes, but I heard that it does work with some organizations, but there's pros and cons with that, and we have looked at it as well.
Thank you. And I'll give an example from another food bank I know where they do use appointment based, and the next available appointment is December 7th. Not helpful today. Thank you. The next question comes in from to say, I work with a provincial advocacy group, and we've been focusing on advocating for food and housing security to the province on behalf of post-secondary students in Ontario. We're having a hard time really getting anywhere with the government. Do you have any suggestions, as it is becoming a dire situation for some students? And we've seen that in our own report. We've touched base with some grassroots organizations looking at co-op type residences, but with a gutted OSAP program, exploitive international student recruitment and inflation, it's difficult to support students. How would you advise this person?
Well, it's actually a really tough one because just from a public opinion standpoint, they're actually a very unsympathetic group of people because they're seen to be privileged to begin with because they're at university. And secondly, all of us old boomers have our own memories of craft dinner and toughing it through university, and may not realize that things are quite a bit different now, and that and it's more difficult than it was at that time. And so as a consequence, most people who've never been to university aren't sympathetic to people who are going to it, and people who've been to university tend to think that it's a rite of passage to tough your way through university in terms of rent and food. So it's one of these things where I don't think you'll get a groundswell of public support around that. And it's why universal programs are better than targeted ones, because then people don't pick who should be targets and who shouldn't be based on who's sympathetic and who isn't sympathetic. But I think that's an argument that you're just going to have to make face-to-face to officials based on facts and evidence and see if you can get them to move on that basis. But I wouldn't expect that you would be able to engender a groundswell of public support behind you on that.
Thank you. Even as a former Quebecer who marched up to Quebec City as a student, unless you've got the masses behind you, it's a slow slog. Okay, the next question is, we've seen, and this might be for you, Olive, we've seen a rise in the number of seniors accessing food banks in the Who's Hungry report. Coincidentally, during COVID, we've seen a rise in delivery services that provided food to seniors, which may account for some of this increase, as they've not been able to access food banks before this. It seems to me that this has shed light on the plight of seniors in terms of their mobility and food insecurity. Can the panel speak to their insights on this population and how best to address their needs through their experience in research?
I'm happy to speak a little bit on this because we had quite a few seniors in our focus groups, and I can still see and see them talk, hear their words, and there were so many issues, and it gets back to the complexity of daily living. For many of the seniors, there was a struggle using transportation, public transit, to get to the food bank, and then the weight of hauling what they were given, what they were able to get back home. And so those were added stressors that I think were enormously improved by home delivery. The issue is the loss of the social contact, with others in the queue, with the staff at the food bank. So if that's able to be, if you will, integrated with some sort of quick check on how the individual is doing, even 5-10 minutes, then that's also helpful. But again, it gets back to, there's a pivotal role that food banks play and the staff who work in them play in helping people with form filling, or just listening or connecting them to those other supports. So I think it needs to be weighed up carefully, but I absolutely do think home delivery is a benefit for many seniors because they're fragile, their mobility issues, and the issues of just hauling heavy canned goods and other goods as well home is not easy. Yeah.
Debbie or Kirsten, any comment?
Well, as someone who actually now has a delivery program, there are a couple of things we do. We actually have picked a specific building, a low-income government housing building with, and we started with 50 seniors and who used to come to the food bank, and we now have 170 plus seniors there, and they previously were unable to access the food bank. So it really has made a difference. But what we also realized was that it's important to make that connection. The 10 minutes you spend talking to someone really makes a difference. Living in Toronto, we're also lucky that we have programs like the Bike Brigade that will will recruit volunteers who'll go on a bicycle and drop off food, and then spend 10 minutes sort of talking to seniors and making those connections. However, we really need to connect them and make some better connections to health and other services, which as food banks, and Kirsten talks about it, we can't do it all, and we need some supports to continue this.
That's a good lead in, Kirsten, I think, to the next question in the chat, which says, does the government donate money to food banks, or are we relying on the community for donations?
So in general, the governments don't support food banks on daily operations. We federally received significant support during COVID, which was the first time we ever reached out for support and got it. And it was necessary. I mean, the system would have, I have no doubt, not been able to sustain given the crisis we were facing. But that is the only time we've received federal funding. There are some pockets of the country that receive provincial support, but in general, food banks are powered by community donations. And just a point on the delivery, we did a report how COVID, how food banks responded during COVID, and it was shocking. I think the number was 70% of food banks implemented a home delivery during COVID. And often meeting unmet needs, as you say, Davey. There were people who weren't necessarily coming to like a newly identified needs. And yet so many food banks have either had to shut those down or are really struggling to figure out how to maintain that on top of what is also sort of a record-setting level of regular service. So again, just echoing what you said, Davey, we're being called on to do things that are probably responsibilities of others in the community.
Thank you. Another question, great panel, is the person says, what do you think are the most important things that the City of Toronto or municipalities can do to improve food security and housing security? An interesting question given the different jurisdictional responsibilities that municipalities have. Any insights?
Well, as a former City of Toronto employee, the City of Toronto certainly is a leader in certain areas, but there are certain things that they can do, especially around the poverty reduction strategy. Just go back and look at the document. There's some great ideas, but we need some implementation. We need real action from the City of Toronto around various areas. There's stuff they can do that's within their control around transit. There's food security that they can do. There's housing. There's housing. Decision making is pretty slow in government, as we know. Certain things that they can do. The City of Toronto was a leader in workforce development, and with the changes to the way the province does employment, it's kind of moved out of the City of Toronto. But there was some really promising practices that they were involved in that really needs to be continued as well. But yeah, so that's my take on the City of Toronto. Big role.
Thank you, Debbie.
If I could just speak to that follow-up with Debbie, it's really interesting because in Hamilton, it almost looks like, and we are to some extent at loggerheads with the premier of the province, particularly when it comes to housing and where we're going to build. The city, meaning residents in this city, we're very clear we don't want expanded boundaries, but we have a lot of infill that we could be doing. There's quite a bit of anger about developments. And I mean, I counted them one time, there were 5 that were all supposed to be targeted for affordable housing. And then the properties stagnated, no development happened, sold, resold, and now they're very upmarket condos, not in fact affordable housing at all. We had a massive housing development in the North End, and the bill for that, for maintaining it, bringing it back to standard, was horrendous. And so they evicted, moved the renters out, boarded them up, and now they're in the process of demolition. Still debatable about what's going to be replacing them, and talk about mixed housing. But I have to say, most people in this city are very skeptical of that, because we're seeing this provincial and municipal discourse that's not very friendly. It doesn't look like they're in tandem. So I think fundamentally they need to be on the same page, number one, because I think the municipality can do a lot of good stuff on the ground, but there also needs to be more consistency across geographies. So this province as a whole could do better. And I mean, we're both talking about urban settings. We're not talking rural or even very far north of Toronto. And I can only imagine that it's even worse there, even more difficult. And so I would like to see much more hand in glove maneuvering around affordable housing, as well as meeting people's income needs and the food security. That's what I think we need to do.
Thank you very much. Okay. One or two more questions have popped in. One was about whether it's somebody who's tried repeatedly to volunteer and has not had any luck. And I guess I would advise 2 things. One is that to understand that most food banks are run with part-time staff and volunteers. And so the strategy of polite persistence is always a good one. If you're not getting an answer, just try again. And the fact that you didn't get a follow-up from us through our website, this is not something I'm pleased to hear, but I'm wondering if it might have, if it was early enough during COVID that we just weren't having our usual cohorts of volunteers in. It's only in the past month or so that we've started to reopen up, and the production hall is busy with the regular range. So please do try again. The need is there. And then if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to throw in the last question. Our agency, which one of the Daily Bread member agencies, the Toronto People with AIDS Foundation, has been providing a plethora of services to community members who are living with and affected by HIV for the past 35 years. One of our flagship programs is the Food Bank program. We've seen significant increases in pre- and post-COVID periods, more so the major beneficiaries, racialized people and refugees. Oh, this might not be a question, but a good comment. With Canada's ambitious immigration plan, this is gradually becoming a major concern that needs urgent attention. Olive, do you want a quick response to that? Especially as newcomers in your title.
I actually do.
Thank you.
Because today I was talking with my students, and the thing was about geography and social determinants of health, about where we live and how that matters. And again, the racialization of different population groups and communities comes to the foreground. And I actually introduced to the students, pointing out, we have these aggressive immigration targets. And later is not the time to fix these problems. We need to start and fix them now. So we're in good shape, not just to recruit immigrants into our country, but to retain them, because we have so much need for new employees, for new citizens in this country. We need to do better. And now is the time to really focus in on that. And maybe that's an opportunity, a window with that aggressive immigration target compared to what we've had in the past, because we're now competing. And we're competing, my industry, nurses, we are falling far short. We're competing with the United Kingdom, United States, France, Germany, and Australia. And right now, Australia is winning that battle for health professionals to come in and work, because I can tell you they have nurses who are able to be registered and working full-time within a month of arrival. Canada, it's more like 3 years, but they have a different process, more integrated process, 2 ministries collaborating together. and the licensing authorities. And we have we're doing these separate siloed things that don't help. And so I think a couple of good examples of moving forward about let's fix the here and now and look future forward, and what that needs to look like is really important.
All right, thanks. Okay, so we'll take that pause from with the audience and switch gears back into the panel discussion. I appreciate the expertise that each of you have brought to the range of questions that popped up for us tonight. So I was watching another webinar last week when Naheed Nenshi was in town, and he described COVID as creating a time of, he called it a wet clay moment, meaning that the systems have been shaken up enough that this is the moment when we can reshape them before they solidify again back into place, and was urging us to think through where could we do that. I think here at Daily Bread and at many food agencies, we've been so busy meeting the rising need that we've talked a lot about what would it look like going forward. And it can leave us with many questions. Many of us are just working on pure determination or a naive commitment to these issues. Others have found ways just to unplug and not listen anymore. And some are hopeful. I always have debates about whether that's just a luxury in these kinds of situations. But hearing all of you, what is it that keeps, I guess, where is the sign of hope for you? What is the way that can keep us moving forward? And what's the thought that you may want to leave us with? Kirsten, you're up on my top left corner. Can I put you on the spot?
Sure. So what gives me most hope is conversations like this. It's meeting colleagues. I've never met a group of people who are more passionate than people who work in food insecurity. And so I take a lot of my own hope. I borrow hope from the energy and passion of those around me and try to sort of move that forward with the audiences that I have. We cannot accept this as the status quo, and we don't have to. There is no reason to accept ever growing food bank use and all of the other things we're talking about as part of the culture we want to build. And I think when I look around to my colleagues, I think we are the ones who are going to make the change. So to me, it's the people around who keep pushing us all forward. So that's where I get my hope.
Can I push you on it then?
Yep.
We're such a small group. How can we make that change? Where are the openings going forward?
I think it's what I was, and David really opened a door for me, but it's the connection between creating a movement of people. If everybody cares, and they do, then it's on us to create a simple, compelling argument that is so unavoidably meaningful that it is just going to happen. And not to say it's going to be easy. I mean, the childcare wasn't easy. It was decades, and I know that. But I think it's on us now to create the momentum around a compelling movement. And it's just given me hope to hear that everybody cares, because then now we've got the tailwinds to go in to talk to the people in power.
Okay. Thank you, David. I'm going to give you the last rousing part of tonight. So hold there, Debbie, and then Olive.
So it helps to actually step away from Canada and move to a country where things are worse. It really reinforces one's hope. So to the audience, I'm in Sri Lanka right now. There's an economic crisis. Most people are living on one meal a day. There's fuel crisis, and there's power cuts every day. So that's my situation. And it actually has increased my hope for Canada with its robust institutions. Yes, they're slow to change, but we have something solid in Canada. And I think the question is fundamentally, what kind of society do we want to create in Canada? I think the best statement came from my friend Doug Anweiler yesterday when I was talking about what I'm seeing in Sri Lanka, where I thought, and I know, David, you're friends with him. So, and Doug used to be on the board. And I said, I thought, yeah, we in Canada have hope, but maybe in Sri Lanka, there's no hope. And then going to this meal program, people there were just so enthusiastic and so hopeful, just like us in Canada. They're doing what they need to do to make things work. And I think, and so Doug sent this to me and he said, hope is the strategy. The power of one is enormous in our world. And I want to leave you with that.
Thank you, Debbie. Olive.
And I mean, I thought, and I'll come back to it, but I agree with Debbie there. Hope is so powerful. And I think about COVID gives us all a lesson about what we can do when we're on the same agenda, although it was global. But I mean, it's interesting because I think people have forgotten what that first year of the pandemic was like, when we didn't have treatments and we didn't have vaccines and we weren't even sure that our testing mechanisms were good. But the notion that we could produce a vaccine, not us on our own, but Canada was a major part of that vaccine lab in Winnipeg and other researchers around the country were major inputs with other research facilities. And we had a vaccine within the year, a vaccine that normally would take decades to produce. So it says something about collectively what we can actually do with the right people, the right tools together and the right impetus. And so I do think that for me is a signal of hope that where we recognize there's a really big crisis on our doorstep, we can deal. We really can. We can come together and we can deal. And frankly, I think this food insecurity, housing insecurity is up there. I really think it's of that magnitude. And the research that I did with Hamilton Food Share, dire and all as it is, was before COVID hit. So that's always my codicil to people. And I think from what I've heard tonight and people saying, well, even in March, things have got worse. And I'm seeing it around me, I'm hearing it. And so I think if the issue is big enough, then we can have that coming together to find the solution that works. And I don't think it'll be as simple as a single solution, but I think 2 to 3. So I have hope. I'm with Debbie on that. I think hope is a great thing. And I heard that from the clients. I saw resilience, but I don't like resilience being used as an excuse to accept status quo ever. And too often it is. And so I think we need to catch the tiger by the tail there and twist it if we hear that word resilience coming up. But so that's my piece. Sorry, longer.
I didn't realize everybody would be so hopeful. I tend to be a bit more of a cynic about these things. So what I'm really interested in, and maybe David, you'll get there too, is what are the specifics then? Like, where do we need to go? What will the future hold?
Okay, well,
Big one.
I got a few things I got to get off my chest here. Maybe before I even attack that question.
Okay.
First of all, Olive, the first year of COVID was so amazing. In May of 2020, I had never, ever seen anything approximating the levels of Canadians who thought the government could be trusted to do the right thing. It was amazing how people were coming together and supporting everything. I have to tell you that 2 years later, it's at historic lows, that same measurement, trusting in government to do the right thing. So COVID built that and destroyed it all in one. I want to take a quick minute, because it's relevant, to address the discussion about seniors earlier. I was really discouraged, to be honest, to hear you talk about the number of seniors that are coming in, because my data told me an incredibly compelling story. My data told me this story, that among people under the age of 35, the prevalence of food insecurity in Canada is 20%. That among people between the ages of 35 and 65, the prevalence of food insecurity is 15%. And that over the age of 65, the prevalence of food insecurity is 0. 1 to 2%. What happens when you turn 65? You get a basic income. You get a guaranteed annual income, and food insecurity disappears. I think that's a very compelling story. Now, it's obviously not true that it's zero, but because you're having people come to your food banks, but nonetheless, that's got to be approximately the measurements, what I'm telling you, out of the data. And, just making an argument to people or to government, that's pretty clear what happens. Money solves that problem, right? And I think that's an important part of the story. So I'm just going to give you some tactical, hard-edged advice from a political consultant, which is, I agree with Naheed Nenshi. I think it's not quite, for the reasons I just said to Olive, not quite the wet clay moment that 2020 was. But I think there still are opportunities here, because I think COVID did open people's eyes to the fragility of a lot of things in our society, including the fragility of a lot of people in our society. So I think that is still there. I think you need a differentiated federal and provincial strategy. You have a 3-year run at the federal level of a coalition Liberal NDP government. Get out of it what you can. It will likely disappear at the end of those 3 years, and you'll have 8 years of Conservative government, where you're going to go into the wilderness on these issues, if I can be blunt. So focus federally right now and get what you can. Once the federal government becomes conservative, if that happens, the provincial governments will start to change away from Conservative to Liberal or NDP. And so then you flip to a provincial strategy of what can we get out of provincial governments in this country. So I would operate on those 2 tracks. I think there is a real window now at the federal level to get a thing done. And I would build alliances with people who can fund you. I would get Michael McCain to help line up business groups to ally with you. I would get some advertising out there on digital media behind an idea, right? Here's a crisis, here's an idea, right? Not here's a crisis and here's 37,000 ideas, right? Here's a crisis and here's an idea. And push that thing and work media. Give them, spoon feed them things, because they're all overworked and overburdened, but they can't, media doesn't have the same impact it used to in the general public, but it still has a big impact with decision makers. They still pay a lot of attention to it. And the media played a big role in galvanizing support. I keep returning to childcare because I think it's a really interesting example, and one that I followed from the inception of that issue in the early 80s right through to effectively its conclusion this past year. So I think, you need a public profile. You need to create a burning platform and some pressure behind an idea. There's public support behind these things. It just needs to be catalyzed. And understand what your political window is, which federally is not insignificant. 3 years is a lot of time to get stuff done, but it is time limited.
That's fabulous. In my early days of political activism, I was taught that after you finished awfulizing, then what will you do? And I think that you've given us a pathway forward. Thank you all for your time tonight. I appreciate the insights that you've been able to bring to us. And I want to say to the people who are watching that if you're looking for what you could do to go forward, read the report. If you haven't, go see Feed Ontario's a new report on Monday. Go see Food Bank Canada report that's already published in a really usable format on their website. And then amplify it and talk about it with people that put it out on social media, and then reach out to government. Let's start creating that parade so that they can jump in front of it and make changes. And yes, we're always, as nonprofits, happy to have any donations of time or treasure from you, because there's work to be done both today and tomorrow. So appreciate you all, and thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you. It was great to participate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.